So I'm going to try and stay away from the board or from the computer and use this. So thank you to everyone joining out there. Thank you to everyone joining in person. So we are going to try this out. I figured we could do a couple of little things, see if there's interest. I'm going to bop around with time as I do these. So I think the next one is next week on Tuesday at noon, just to see what is a time that is more likely to gather people, that people are available. But I think I'm also going to record them, and with any luck, I may put them on YouTube or something along those lines, so people who miss one or miss several can still get something out of this one. So for those of you who don't know me, but I think most of you do, my name is Dr. Christy Barnwell. I'm a professor in the history department, and my expertise is in modern Middle East. I started my journey with Palestine back my sophomore year of college. I was required to take a non-US history class. And so I took this one because there were two offerings, and I liked the professor that took the Middle East one better than I had heard rumors about how mean and tough the other one was. So I took the Middle East one, and one of our assignments was to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict in 10 pages. And so I did. I solved it. The State Department has not asked for my paper on this, but someday they will, I'm sure. Then I kept taking classes. I remained a history major, but as I went through, I kept taking all of these classes on the Middle East. And before I knew it, when I graduated with a minor in Near Eastern Studies without even having worked towards getting that. That was my affiliation with it, and I just kept going. And so when I applied to graduate school, I applied to study the Middle East and in the context of British Empire. I also was under the misguided belief that for me, Palestine was too much of, like, I was too committed to and too personally invested and felt too strongly about Palestine and the injustices of the Arab-Israeli conflict, that I wouldn't be an objective historian. And so I went off into other directions with my area of specialty and expertise. And so where I have published on is primarily related to the United Arab Emirates and the Gulf. But I've also published a little bit on and continued research in and teach about the Arab-Israeli conflict, about Palestine and Palestinian culture and Greater Syria and those kinds of things, because you've got to follow where your passion is. And I think that these are incredibly important issues. So the idea for this was that we could take these really simple documents, or not simple perhaps, but these short isolated documents, and put them into greater context to draw out bigger ideas about the roots of conflict between Palestine and Israel. Where did all of this get started, and how do we get better sense of the historical framework for moving forward and understanding where we are today, how it is that Palestine, Gaza, the West Bank are under the circumstances they are. How did we get from there to here? And so this time we're going to talk about the Balfour Declaration. And we're going to talk about the Balfour Declaration in the context of British imperialism, the context of Zionism and anti-Zionism, and then sort of the results of that in the form of Arab resentment of Western sort of duplicity that came out of World War I. And when we do the next one, which is Resolution 242, that we'll be talking about the two-state solution versus the one-state solution, and the various ways in which different iterations of these ideas developed over time. So we'll use that document, which comes out of the 1967 war, as a way to think about this question of how many states can we fit into this tiny territory. So we'll go ahead and start with the Balfour Declaration. And so Courtney, if you would mind hitting the first slide of what we're going to do. There we go. So the Balfour Declaration is an awkward run-on sentence that says a whole lot of nothing, but has this huge outsized impact on what we think of as this question of the creation of Israel, and whether or not Palestine would become a nation. It was issued November 2nd, 1917 by Arthur Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary of Britain. And he issued it in a very short run-on statement to a guy named Rothschild. We'll talk about him in a minute. And then it became publicly issued or sort of printed in the newspaper. So we're going to start with talking about the declaration itself. We'll then talk about how it came into existence, like the process by which Arthur decided that he was going to issue his famous declaration, and what went into it. And then we'll talk a little bit about the debates around whether they should even participate in this, the context for World War I, and then sort of Arab reactions to and the consequences of the Balfour Declaration going forward. So I'm just going to read the declaration. His Majesty's government, take a deep breath because it is a run-on sentence. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So for those of you in the room, let's pick out a couple of phrases that sort of trigger like a thought, like what in there. When I say it promises a lot, it promises nothing, it's very confusing and ambivalent. What are some points of like questioning within that, or what are some phrases that sort of might hint at that? Yeah.
It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done with which may prejudice civil and religious rights of not existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Like, yeah. That sounds like a clear one that came to mind.
Yeah. So one thing that does seem clear is that there should be the creation of whatever a national home is in this place, but that the creation of it should not in any way impinge upon the people living there already, right? The community's already living there. What else? Yes, Hannah.
Define what these civil and religious rights are. Like, it's very nebulous.
Yeah, very general, some civil rights, some political rights, religious rights, but we don't know what those are. What's a national home? What's a national home? Is that a nation? Or is it just a home? Is it a house where you can put up a flag? Like, what is it, right? We know that a nation state is a defined term. It's a thing. It's a political entity that was recognized within the international system. It is not, like a national home is not a politically recognized thing, right? It's just kind of this idea, right? What do the British promise they're going to do? They're going to try really hard, right? We promise to try. We'll try our best, but they don't make any promises as to what that commitment looks like. The idea of this last part that you grabbed about like the not compromising other people's rights was a compromise position that the British government would take when it issued this. So this is not what the authors or the people who were advocating for the British government to put forward a document. This is not the full promise of what they wanted. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looked like as we go forward. So this slide, thank you. Sorry, she's got my script, but I'm going off script a little bit, so I'm making it hard for Courtney. I apologize. Okay, so Balfour issued his statement in the middle of World War I. He issued it in November 1917. It was in the middle of the war, and that's going to play a really important place of context for deciding why it is that Britain was going to stick its neck out and put this language out there, right? He did this following a real effort on the part of this guy, Chaim Weizmann, who was a real advocate for and the leader of the Zionist chapter, the world, sort of the Zionist organization in England. So Chaim Weizmann is considered the architect of this declaration. And his friend Harry Sacker would write a decade later, celebrating and reflecting on the Balfour Declaration, that without Dr. Weizmann, we would have received neither a declaration nor a mandate, nor international recognition in a Jewish national home in Palestine. So it was Chaim Weizmann who's really seen as the key person. So who is he? And how did he bring this Balfour Declaration into being? He was born in today's Belarus, then under control of the Russian imperial government. He was born in 1874 in a Jewish home. He grew up in a family that was Zionist, that is called for or were committed to the idea of the creation of a Jewish state. He was educated in Germany and Switzerland and traveled around Europe in various capacities before settling in Manchester in England in 1904. He became active once he got into the UK. He became active in supporting and reviving the English chapter of the Zionist Federation. So the World Zionist Federation was an organization founded in 1897 and then established chapters all across Europe and in the United States with the idea of developing an organization for raising funds and organizing plans for migration to Palestine for the establishment of a Jewish state called Eretz Israel. Okay, so Eretz Israel was sort of the goal, this land of Israel. By 1917, when Balfour would be issuing the Zionist Federation or issuing the Balfour Declaration, the Zionist Federation would have already been fundraising and supporting immigration and colonization in Palestine. There were 5 famous waves of early migration into Palestine before we get to the establishment of Israel. And the first of these was in 1881 to 1903. And then the second of these was 1904 to 1914. So by 1914, the World Zionist Organization or Federation had started fundraising and organizing political campaigns in the hopes of creating this movement and supporting this movement. The war, World War I, had slowed down Zionist migration because the Ottoman government, which was in control of Palestine, had started closing the borders, monitoring things more carefully because they were dealing with famine, rebellions, and all of these other kinds of things that, and so they had made it more difficult. So between 1914 and the end of World War I, it was much more difficult for migration into Palestine to occur. The British chapter of the World Zionist Organization was in complete and total disarray before Weizmann got involved. It had made little progress in cohering, that is, creating a community of people to advocate for its goals. And so it was not making a lot of progress in advancing these ideals of establishing a Jewish state and gaining the support of the British government. Weizmann established a small subcommittee within the chapter to generate several drafts of what would be eventually the Balfour Declaration that they would then submit to various colleagues who were participating in government in order to get this in front of the British government's eyes and have them figure out how to endorse it. So what Weizmann and his committee really tried to do was get the government to endorse the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine where Jewish people could live with full autonomy and start sort of building up a national life and culture. And what they specifically wanted the British government to do, in addition to endorsing the idea, was to back the creation of a chartered company, that is, issue a charter that would give a company, which was going to be called the Jewish National Colonizing Corporation, sort of the sole control, economic control, where the Federation could put its money in and it would become invested, and then it could be spent out into various efforts to create and build up the Jewish community in Palestine. So they wanted to create this company, and then the British would back this company and offer it its support along the same kinds of lines, hinting at imperialism of the chartered government that they used to start the British Empire in India and so on. This would allow the corporation to have free immigration of Jews to Palestine with British backing, and they could support the buildup of community through economic development and political support from this company. So the committee produced a draft that had all of that in there. They sent it to their friend Walter Rothschild, who was a banker with a lot of money. He himself had personally financed some of these early efforts to go into Palestine. And he was also a member of parliament at one point, and so he traveled around in circles within the Liberal Party because he had been part of the political establishment. He was friends with Herbert Samuel, and Herbert Samuel was, again, a Zionist and was a member of the Liberal Party and was active in government circles. And so Chaim Weizmann talks to Rothschild, Rothschild talks to Samuel, and Samuel and Rothschild start making the circles within their political friendships to get these drafts forward. Herbert Samuel had also been advocating for a while for British recognition of and support for a Jewish state. In 1915, he had argued that it would be mutually beneficial to both the Zionists and the British government and their imperial goals if they endorsed the creation of a Jewish national home. And he wrote this memorandum called The Future of Palestine that he circulated. He said, I mentioned that two things would be essential: that the state should be neutralized, that is, that it should be without no military and it's not attached to any specific other organization, that it should not be large, it would not be large enough to defend itself, and that free access of Christian pilgrims should be guaranteed into Palestine. I also said that it would be a great advantage if the remainder of Syria were then annexed to France, so that it would be far better for the state, the Jewish state, to have a European power as a neighbor than a Turk, that is the Ottomans. So Samuel helped introduce the original drafts of the Balfour Declaration, had it circulate within government circles, and he hitched the future of the state of Israel to the British imperialist goals. He argued that while, I need a slide change here. That's all right. He argued that while Palestine on the face of it had little to recommend itself to Britain, its strategic location right here, right, where is it? Right here, would serve British goals, which is particularly protecting Britain's possessions in Egypt and its access to the Suez Canal, through which Britain could reach all of its other imperial locations, including India, Australia, and areas in East Asia. So he said, this idea of having a foothold in Palestine would give Britain extra opportunity or an extra buffer to protect its interests in Suez and the broader imperial goals. Balfour picked up this idea and he described Suez as the wasp waist of the British Empire, right? That skinny little place between the segments of the wasp, right? So he picked up on this idea and recognized this was a very vulnerable place of the British Empire, and liked this idea that Palestine would serve as this kind of buffer. There was dissent within the British government as to whether or not they should issue the Balfour Declaration. One of the most outspoken critics was Edwin Montagu, who was himself a practicing Jew and a member of the cabinet. And he had become Secretary of State for the government of India by the time we get to July 1917. And he was vehemently opposed to the idea of the creation of this Balfour Declaration because he saw the creation of a Jewish state as anti-Semitic. So he said, I assume that it means that Muslims and Christians are to make way for the Jews, and that the Jews shall be put in all positions of preference and should be peculiarly associated with Palestine in the same way that England is with the English or France with the French, that Turks and other Muslims in Palestine under this Balfour Declaration in this Jewish state in Palestine will be regarded as foreigners, just in the same way as Jews will hereafter be treated as foreigners in every country but Palestine. Perhaps also citizenship must be granted only as a result of a religious test. So what he was concerned about was that the creation of a state, a Jewish state, would actually heighten anti-Semitism in Europe, and that Jews in Europe would be pushed out of their homes there with the expectation that they should go to Palestine, and recognize that in the creation of Palestine, Muslims and Christians would be disaffected and would be harmed as part of this. So he continued to speak passionately along with others against the declaration as initially proposed. British imperialist goals won out, though. Britain was in the midst of war, and it was trying to weaken the Ottoman efforts in the Middle East and in the war more generally. And so the British were looking around, trying to get the US to get involved in the war to support Britain, trying to get Russia to help support British efforts in various places within the war. And so in the minds of many of Balfour and others was this anti-Semitic trope that Jews are part of a network of people with this secret network that could influence governments, right? And so this is a very anti-Semitic trope. You may have heard people talking about this idea of anti-Semitism with the idea of Jews being able to pull these strings behind the scenes, right? And the British were participating in that because Balfour hoped that in issuing the Balfour Declaration, they would win over Jewish networks of influence in the United States and in Russia, and that Jews would then pull the strings of their governments to get Wilson and others to get involved on Britain's side, right? It didn't work. While Woodrow Wilson acknowledged that he was to some degree in support of the Balfour Declaration sentiments, he wasn't going to publicly participate in that, and Russia had its own concerns. But part of that, Tom Segev, One Palestine, is the book that he wrote, sort of pulls all of these kinds of ideas together to demonstrate the level of anti-Semitism that fed into the issuing of the Balfour Declaration. Let's see. Okay. The other piece of this was Britain's war efforts that were going on during the war. Britain wanted help from the US in Europe in particular, but Britain had also been trying to foster internal rebellions against the Ottoman Empire. And so the year before, Britain had already been making promises by the time the Balfour Declaration was issued, contradictory promises in an effort to win the war no matter what. So in 1916, Mark Sykes, a British diplomat, had made an agreement with a French diplomat, Georges Picot, called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which said that France and Britain would divide up Greater Syria and Mesopotamia among themselves if they won the war. The year before that, Britain and the British government had corresponded with Hussein al-Hashimi, who was an Ottoman official here of the Hejaz region of the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula. And he had said, Mark's McMahon, the British official, had written to Hussein of Mecca and had said, hey, if you can gather together an army of Arabs to fight against the Ottomans, Britain will promise you military support and the creation of an Arab state at the end of the war that would make up Greater Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Hejaz region. And so while it's often T.E. Lawrence, the British official, who gets credit for Britain's war campaign in the Middle East, it's actually these Arab forces led by, this is Hussein, led by his sons. This is Faisal, this is Abdullah, and this is Ali, I believe. No, Ali, Abdullah, and Faisal. Sorry, it's hard to look up from the screen and talk about who I'm looking at. And these are Arab forces that served in that campaign. So in 1917, the British government has already made a variety of promises to the Arabs, to the French, about what they're going to do with all of this territory. And then they move forward with the Balfour Declaration as we know it, which was a pared down, non-committal version of what Weizmann had been asking for. And the issuing of the Balfour Declaration in the wake of the war would have three big reactions and impacts that I'm going to discuss here. The first was that for Weizmann and for the Zionist movement, this was a success. It was the first international recognition of and support for the creation of a Zionist state. And it gave an organizing force and motivation to the Zionist chapters worldwide that had been struggling to find direction. So it gave traction to that movement. The second thing was that it set the stage for the end of the war to establish Britain as the imperial power. They call it the mandatory power, but it's just a new form of imperialism, over southern Syria, carving out southern Syria as a place where the special goals and plan was for Palestine would be sort of issued by the British. The British would be in charge of administering Palestine. The League of Nations would direct them legally that they would be in charge of this. And the League of Nations directed Britain to use this mandate as a way to solve what would be referred to as the Palestine question. The other is one that came out, unfolded in the period of the post-war period, which was that the discovery of the various contradictory promises between Britain and all of these different forces would lead to a deep distrust and sense of enmity between the Arabs throughout the Middle East and the British, and would sour Arab relations with Britain throughout this period of the Palestinian mandate that would take place in the interwar period. So that when it comes down to actually administering the mandate, Arabs in Palestine were already resistant to cooperating with the British in the form of whatever it would be, because they didn't believe that they could believe the British in any plans for that place. One scholar, Aouni Bey Abdul Hadi, critiqued, shares this sentiment. In 1932, he wrote in his critique of the Balfour Declaration that from this Balfour Declaration, the contradictory nature of British pledges is quite apparent. For Palestine, Syria, and Iraq cannot form an independent Arab state, according to British promises to King Hussein in 1915, and at the same time have a Palestinian national home have in Palestine a national home for the Jews. He and other scholars would call on and sort of echo back to the untrustworthiness of Britain when it came to this, so that when the mandate of Palestine under British control came to be, it was already set up in such a way that Palestinians did not feel like they could work with the British government to create a cooperative future. So there's that. I'm going to leave that now and let us do questions. I don't know, how did I do on time? That was a lot. So if you need to repeat anything, I'm happy to do so, but I wanted to make sure I left time for questions. Go wherever you feel like starting, and we'll work our way through it.
I guess through all of this, Zionism being brought up, and I feel like my current understanding of Zionism is kind of watered down, and I was wondering if you could kind of explain what that is, where it came from, and yeah.
Absolutely. So Zionism, in its most basic form, in its definite form, is the belief that Jews should have a nation, right? So nationalism was this idea that sort of became sort of the political identity, started taking shape as the best political form in the 18th and 19th centuries, really caught on. This idea that instead of these empires or kingdoms ruled by an elite, that the people themselves should be able to direct the government to meet the social contract between the people and the rulers, right? So the idea of representative government, that we all have a right to pay our taxes and have a say in what those taxes do, that's the social contract, right? And that was expressed by Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, and then sort of elaborated into this idea of the nation as the perfect political form, right? And so between the 18th century and the 20th century, that's how we got there. And more states started participating in that, and the international world sort of fell into alignment with this idea of the nation as like the best form. Now, many Jews in the 18th and 19th centuries were increasingly educated within European circles and started participating in civic life. Were increasingly, and this is really at its heart a secular movement, Zionism, right? It's not about religious identity. There was sort of a kind of enlightenment within Jewish intellectual communities. It's called the Haskalah. And it's this idea that less so about religious practice and doctrine, but that Judaism, or that the Jewish community, is made up of a shared culture and heritage and language and tradition, and that this is an expression of like a kind of Jewishness. So as people were sort of exploring Jewishness as like a historical phenomenon and a cultural phenomenon in intellectual circles, they were also participating increasingly in European governments. And a lot of Jews saw themselves primarily as part of the nation that they belonged or that they lived in and felt they belonged to. They saw themselves as German, or they saw themselves as French, or they saw themselves as, so that this was an assimilation movement. The idea that Jews could assimilate into European life and national life and have a Jewish cultural component, but be primarily part of the nation where they lived. But there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the 19th century. And in the face of that anti-Semitism, some Jews started turning towards this idea of Zionism as the best way to protect Jewish identity and sort of Jewish nationhood and citizenship in the form of creating their own nation. The idea that they could never be fully assimilated into other national lives. And so Zionism is very much a response to the anti-Semitism of Europe, in the sense that many Jews didn't feel like they could safely ever fully integrate into European life. So they started looking for a place where they could create a Jewish state that would protect Jewish identity within this idea of a nation. And so you're listening to activists sort of talking about this, and you're learning and diving into it. People will talk about how the Zionist organizations and Zionist movements started looking at different places that they could go to create sort of a kernel of a national home that would build out into a nation. And for many reasons, Palestine ended up being the most convenient location because it does have way historical ties that they could use for fundraising purposes and for drawing people to migrate. And also because the Ottoman Empire had loosey-goosey borders, because it was a big empire and didn't have a whole lot of control over it. And so Palestine became the place where Zionists really sort of focused their energies on, and where they planned, where the World Zionist Federation started planning its goals around that idea. So at its heart, in its essence, Zionism is the belief that Jews have a right to a nation state based on the idea of Jewish citizenship.
I don't know. The way that I've like thought about it, I mean, I know like growing up in church, you learn about the Jews and how God has promised them like a specific like land, and that's part of, and that's kind of what I've tied Zionism to. But I like how you put it as like a secular.
Yeah, it was a secular movement that has then taken on additional religious connotations but in its origins, it was largely secular. And there are a lot of splinters within the Jewish community now and broadly, historically. So people like Montagu was a practicing Jew who believed that the creation of a Zionist state or the creation of a Jewish state would ultimately lead to greater anti-Semitism. And we're fearful of that it would make it harder for people to assimilate into the societies they wanted to belong into. Others on the religious aspect of it have argued that religiously it's a violation within Judaism to return without permission from God. right? That is supposed to be granted when God allows it to be granted, and that by forcing that back into being, it's actually a violation of Jewish principle. And then there are other Jews who believe that Zionism is a tool, is a way by which they could return and sort of bring about God's wish for Jews to return to the land of Israel. So there's a lot of different splinters in the way that gets interpreted in its current expression. So a lot of the settlements, the settlers and settler activism in the West Bank and the expansion of that, as well as some of their activities on the Haram al-Sharif, which is sort of the religious space that is like the mosque and so on, that's very important within Islam and is located on the Jewish temple, right? Their activism is focused on that as a way to rebuild or to build the next temple to bring about the response or sort of the full messianic vision.
We have a question up here. It says, may I ask for some clarification? I've heard two different takes on the Al-Hussein agreement when it came to Palestine. I've seen arguments that Palestine was not a part of the original agreement, while others argue it was. Could you provide more information on that?
So yes, and yes, both of those two arguments exist. So you can actually look up if you wanted to read. It's called the Hussein-McMahon agreements, and you can read them yourselves to see what's going on as far as like how these things are delineated. At no time did the letters actually draw out a map and then color in which parts would be to whom. So what they did is say, like, here's the state, here's what we would estimate the boundaries to be, and this is what we think the boundaries would be. And so it kind of lays out, there's some back and forth between McMahon and Hussein as to what territories are specifically included and excluded. If you read it, though, Hussein definitely had the belief that and understood, based on his understanding of the territory, that almost all of the territory from the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia and then down the Hijaz of the Arabian Peninsula were included, and that there might be some room for some fudging of things. But his belief was, and his understanding was, this is what he was fighting for. And in the wake of World War I, when the war came to a close, his son, Faisal, actually marched into Damascus and tried to establish an Arab state. And the British didn't say he couldn't do it. It was the French that finally came in on the basis of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and sort of forced him out. And the British chose not to mess with the French on that. They just kind of let it happen. They still agreed that they owed him territory. But by that time, there's also, like, the Saudis were starting to expand in the Arabian Peninsula. And so they kind of pushed into, and the British said, well, we're just not going to back Hussein and the Hijaz either. And so the compromise position ended up being that Hussein didn't get anything, but his sons were put in charge of what is now known as Iraq and Jordan as sort of a compromise. So you can read through the documentation yourself. It's not extremely long. Hussein certainly believed and understood from the letters that he had control of all of that territory. And I think most scholars would have looked at that and argued that, in fact, he had been promised this Arab state in almost all, if not all, of the territory he was thinking it was. I mean, McMahon sort of says, well, we've promised some stuff to the French. So regardless, except for that, you can have everything. But McMahon didn't explain to Hussein how much he had promised to the French. So he specifically left Hussein in the dark about that. Other questions?
Did McMahon have anything to do with the Balfour Declaration and like the creation of Israel? Like, was he aware of that and was hiding that from Hussein as well, or was that just something completely separate?
I think, if I recall correctly, for a good chunk of this, McMahon was in Egypt, because at some point he was put in charge of like the central command of the Middle East, which was based in Egypt. Sykes knew he'd made this Sykes-Picot agreement, and he definitely knew that he was with the Balfour Declaration and was part of those conversations. So the degree to which everybody knew how all of these pieces were being coordinated, it's not the time of email, so it's going through regular mail. But I think there was a general sense that the main thing was Britain would win the war, and then they'd sort out their problems later on. Yes.
What is the Balfour Declaration used in the modern context? Like, is it still used to offer Israel legitimacy, or have other documents sort of taken that place?
Britain, or not Britain, Israel still celebrates, and like they're just the formation of the Balfour Declaration. It is still sort of understood as kind of this key document that gave legitimacy to the Zionist movement. And Palestinians can still point to the Balfour Declaration as part of the insidious practice of the empire. Right? So yes, it is still kind of a touchstone, even though the many years since then have kind of not erased, but other events have taken on bigger, practical, concrete forms. But there's still the recognition that, I mean, the Balfour Declaration, the language of the Balfour Declaration gets echoed in the mandate that gives Britain control over Palestine. And Herbert Samuel would then, I don't think I mentioned this, Herbert Samuel, who had participated in this, would become the High Commissioner of the mandate in Palestine, with the job of enacting the principles of the Balfour Declaration in the Palestine mandate. So it's baked into everything that comes afterwards. Other questions? Yeah. And thank you to Courtney for handling these the slides. Any other questions?